wired into technology transformation, this is the Digital Bulletin podcast.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, delete where applicable. How are you doing today, listener? This is episode number 9 of the Digital Bulletin podcast. I have two faces on a screen in front of me for today's recording. One of them belongs to Digital Bulletin content director, James Henderson. How are you, James?
Good afternoon, Ben. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And the other is Romilly Broad, Digital Bulletin CEO, complete with a new goatee.
It's a COVID goatee. It's called I Don't Care Anymore because no one sees me.
You do care though, because you've shaped it.
Well, I haven't let it turn into, like a scarecrow or anything. I'm trying to keep it reasonable for my family.
Any opinions on Mr. Broad's facial hair, James?
I was always told by my mother if I had nothing nice to say, then say nothing at all. So I'll take that advice, I suppose.
Obviously, listener, this is all completely pointless chat to you because you cannot see Rom's goatee, but it is indeed very well cultivated. I would say permanent.
We'll see about that. Not if my daughter's got anything to do with it anyway. She's in the Henderson ranks of anti-goatee.
James's full beard is its usual strong self. Anyway, before you switch off, listener, let's just keep you here. Right, today, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to chat all things tech for good, which is our shiny new toy here at Digital Bulletin. We're also going to explore our Norfolk County Council case study. And we're going to hear from Jessica Nordlander, who is Sweden's most innovative leader of 2019, and that's official. She's going to be talking about how tech can solve the complexities of remote working. So an exciting pod for you today, folks, and we're going to kick it off with some news. In the wake of the protests following the death of Black American George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer, facial recognition technology has come under enormous scrutiny, especially the nature of how it's being used by law enforcement. In the past couple of weeks, tech companies have responded, with IBM stopping all work around facial recognition and Amazon and Microsoft distancing themselves from the technology for now. Elsewhere in the past month, we've seen the Indian telecoms industry attract an astonishing amount of investment. This is a fascinating story as all of tech's big players aim for a slice of the pie. India's 1.4 billion people are becoming more connected very quickly, and Facebook and Amazon are among those making bets in the country. In the world of driverless cars, Volkswagen completed a 2.6 billion investment in self-driving technology startup Argo, meaning they joined forces with Ford in running one of the most exciting companies in the automotive space. We've also seen Wipro appoint a new CEO, SoftBank sell off some of its assets to fill a COVID-shaped hole in its finances, and Google and Sonos lock legal horns over smart speakers. Now, you can find a full roundup of the reporting on these stories and many, many more via the bulletin on digitalbulletin.com. Yes, that's digitalbulletin.com. .com now, happy days. But now we are going to engage in some shameless self-congratulation, because this has been a big week for Digital Bulletin, and it's not just because we're now .com. We've launched our sister publication and platform, Tech for Good. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory, really, but Tech for Good is for stories of how new technologies are having a positive impact on the world around us, whether that be societal, environmental, economic, anything really. Our first magazine is live now, exploring tech themes around topics like education, healthcare, and social good. But, let's, Rom, I'm going to come to you now as CEO of our esteemed company and get you really to sort of give us a bit of a backstory on what Tech for Good, how Tech for Good came to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've obviously collectively spent the last couple of years traveling around the world when we were allowed to do that sort of thing, meeting lots of pretty impressive people, leaders in a technology context, bringing about large scale change and transformation in organizations of note, so multinational organizations. And that is really interesting. And obviously, we're not going to stop doing that. But one of the things that kept coming up during that process was the fact that where you might expect them to be saying, look, we're doing this to drive efficiency, to cut costs, etc. Often they would say, no, the primary motivator for here is to reduce our impact on the environment, to make a better environment for our people to work in, to give them better balanced lives between home and work. And so we thought, you know what, this is a topic of its own right. We're seeing lots of examples of technologies that are impacting the world in a positive way, and that's certainly the intent behind them. And that was the origin of the idea, really, behind Tech for Good. And so here we are.
James, is there a sense that these topics, very relevant, obviously 6 months ago, but given the sort of events of 2020, that they're even more relevant right now?
Yeah, certainly. I think Tech for Good is one of the sort of key themes at the moment within technology, and I think we've seen that by some arch rivals, really, if you like, coming together. We've seen the likes of sort of Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, to name a few, sort of working in tandem to develop technologies for track and trace, to allow other companies to sort of plug into their APIs. We've seen other companies in other areas pivot their operations so they can develop hand sanitizers and PPE. I mean, we even saw a brewery changing up so they could produce hand sanitizers. So I think it's definitely made companies within the technology sphere and throughout industry come together to really work for the wider good. So we had no idea that this would happen, obviously, but it's certainly more timely than ever what we're speaking about.
Absolutely, yeah. There's certainly a switch in emphasis. Rom, we've known for a while that technology's power and the power of technology companies has grown enormously. Is it fair to say that their responsibilities haven't quite sort of measured up against that growth, and it's only really now that we're starting to get a sense that these companies are really sort of seeing that their power comes with a lot of responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is going to be one of the big stories, really, of the next 5 years or so. I mean, if you just look at the COVID situation, what we've seen, and we've got some reporting of this actually in Tech for Good. We've seen a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, particularly, say, healthcare organizations, rapidly move to adopt new technologies. And those technologies largely are to be found in the cloud. And whether you're talking about Microsoft Teams or other video conferencing type applications that have been used in healthcare, for example, Microsoft has generously made that very easy for hospitals all around the world to quickly mobilize their people so that they could work from home where possible, etc. And they've been able to make that process easy by waiving license fees and things. Mm-hmm. After this is done, those hospitals will have become, somewhat hooked on those technologies. They're not going to, now they've got them, they don't want to give them back, right? But now there's a new cost burden, and the control of those platforms now is not with the hospitals, it's with Microsoft. And you can look at that in all sorts of ways. We've got technologies rapidly advancing where the ownership and control of the infrastructure of those technologies is ultimately owned by the companies with the resources to have those technologies, i.e. vast numbers of data centers all around the place and the servers to put applications on and all the rest of it. Therefore, an increasingly small number of people own increasingly more of the world's digital infrastructure. There's costs and benefits to all of that, but with that kind of control comes a huge amount of responsibility. And I think over the next few years, we will start to see regulatory pressure on that, where particularly things like the EU start to look at the fact that all of their major companies and institutions seem to be running on platforms that are owned by like 2 or 3 companies, and none of them are in the EU. And so what are they going to do about that? How anti-competitive is that? How risky is that to national security and things? This is going to be something that plays out. This goes into AI as well, of course. AI applications are running on the same platforms. Who
Exactly.
owns that?
No, I was going to say that intersection you're talking about between sort of government, the big technology companies, and us, the users of the technology. That's a theme that emerges in one of the main sort of feature articles. In fact, in the cover story for Tech for Good, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And so there's a really big question on the cover of Tech for Good, which is an essential the central premise of that, and is AI itself as an application is going to be the source of the greatest redistribution of power relatively in society ever, potentially. Who sets the rules? And that's a really big question. We don't know the answer, but the people we spoke to, George, who formerly was head of global strategy at Ipsos, and Omar, who was the head of engineering innovation at NASA until very recently, both gave us opinions on that. They say, look, right now, no one's in control apart from the people that own the infrastructure, and that's not very many people. But that doesn't mean we haven't got an opportunity to think properly about that. But we haven't got very long. So it's going to be an interesting few years to be witnessing all of this.
I think the goatee has grown just a little bit as well during that speech there, Rom. And James, just to move it on to one of the points Ron brought up there, and the concerning sort of theme that is emerging right now in the world, where a smaller and smaller sort of group of companies have more and more control over the technology that we all rely on, ultimately, not just use, but rely on. And that's going to be a major theme across Tech for Good as we move forward with this new sort of publication and platform. Is that something that really kind of worries you? And do you see a sort of positive outcome for that, really?
Well, again, it talks to how much power these companies have, and I think that increasingly they seem to have more power and more influence than our actual governments, which is pretty scary. And then you consider how the major Chinese companies that want to have a piece of every 5G network on the planet, how sort of tied in they are with the leadership in Beijing as well. It's almost like if you want to have any sort of technology or use any sort of technology services whatsoever, then you have to use these companies, because, as you said, there is almost a monopoly, if you like.
Is it incumbent on the authorities, so the governments of the day, to really recognize how big an issue this is and use their power of governance to sort of control this?
I think they have to, but at the same time, if you're Google or Apple or somebody like that, and you put so much money into an economy where it's the American economy every year, and all of those jobs that they have in Silicon Valley, you hold as much power as the government does to you, because they could just pick it up and move it somewhere else. They have the cash reserves to do that. So it's difficult. I was speaking to somebody the other day that said, look, we almost need like a United Nations for this. So all countries need to come together and use their collective power to lobby these technology companies to act in the public interest. And I think most of them do, but obviously, it feels like it could just be a runaway train at any point, because they have so much power, and they have so much data, and they have so much influence. You feel almost powerless, and we all, to some extent, use them.
Yeah, here we are sat on Google's virtual meeting tool,
right,
doing this conversation. Rom, this is Tech for Good. Let's try and put a good spin on it. There's still a huge amount of opportunity here as well, though, isn't there? We're not at the end of the road by any means, and there is still an opportunity. And as I said at the start of this conversation, the big companies are now doing a lot more than they ever have done to shoulder their fair share of responsibility, whether that be around sort of environmental issues or social issues that have obviously been particularly relevant recently.
Yeah, well, let's be absolutely clear. I don't think this is a negative story. Actually, it's kind of it's an issue that needs to be tackled, and plenty of people are tackling it. So the other thing to remember is that we have this access now to this vast computational power that is going to be good for society. Whatever algorithm it is you're deploying against whatever problem it is, we now have this opportunity to have better healthcare, better institutions, better access to democracy, better, or anything you can think of, really. IoT, making agriculture more profitable and productive. Those things are possible because those companies have invested in building the infrastructure to enable it. So you don't want to dismiss that. That's not a threat in of itself. That's a huge opportunity. On the other hand, you do need to have transparency of governance on that. Otherwise, as James is saying, how do we know that that's actually acting in the public interest rather than the interest of their shareholders? And so there's a reckoning to come where we try and resolve these problems. And I'm confident that we will, because ultimately, if those companies don't act in the public interest, that's not necessarily particularly sustainable for them as a company in the end, because that means people will step in and they'll probably nationalize it or something crazy. So it will resolve. And frankly, the benefits far outweigh the costs.
Just one last thing to add to that as well. I think that it's been proven pretty much that companies that do act in an ethical manner and do act in a way that is positive outperform companies that don't in pretty much every metric, including, for example, retaining and attracting the best talent in industries where there are huge talent gaps. So, there are huge reasons why companies should be doing this if they're not already. And it's not just a box ticking exercise. It actually equates to pounds and pence or dollars and cents on the bottom line as well. So,
yeah. No, it's really interesting. Just as a final point on this, guys, I know you both speak to people who are leading technology change quotes in their companies and industries. Yeah, I know this topic comes up a lot about sort of sustainable tech and responsible tech. Do you feel that there is a genuine desire from the individuals right at the heart of this to make sort of positive change in this area? Rom, I'll come to you.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that desire, as expressed to us repeatedly over the last 2 years, is why we created Tech for Good in the first place, because it's not necessarily, the application of technology for profit. That's not really the driving force behind a lot of these things. Companies know that, as James has just said, unless they act in a responsible way, they will not be a sustainable company ultimately. But also, these are human beings, just like you and I. They want to do this because they know it's the right thing to do in the end. And so, because a company cannot survive if its own people fundamentally disagree with what it's doing, off they go somewhere else to a company that is. And so, yeah, absolutely, at the very top. And I think that's one thing that we've seen over the last few years lagging, perhaps, is that the very top leadership of a lot of big companies hasn't necessarily prioritized the ethical correctness of their technology investments. That's changing, I think. And you can feel that everywhere in the world, whether it's in terms of environment or social unrest or indeed disease and our ability to handle it. I think we'll see some rapid progress now. Maybe I'm an optimist, but I think we will.
Yeah. Well, certainly we hope so, because that'll be good for our platform, thinking very selfishly. Jane,
that as well, I suppose.
Obviously, we're a very responsible organisation as well.
Very,
very, very responsible.
Apart from long facial hair, that's not very responsible.
All right.
James, obviously, we're sort of talking already about how the sort of governance of technology is going to be very important going forward. And one of the topics we're going to cover in Tech for Good is public sector and the kind of work that public sector organizations are doing. Do you want to talk a bit about your feature with the CIO of the City of Atlanta over in the States on Tech for Good? Because this is a really interesting story, isn't it? Obviously a smaller scale, but certainly a really interesting example of public sector technology initiative.
This, in my opinion, and obviously I am biased in that A, I wrote it, and B, it is in Tech for Good. So we spoke to the City of Atlanta's CIO, a chap called Gary Brantley, who was a really fantastic interview. And it's really, it's a tale of two viruses, if you like. One, a computer virus, a cyber attack, and one being COVID-19. Now, Gary Brantley took the position up at the tail end of 2018 when the city of Atlanta was still dealing with a cyber attack that it suffered. And it was actually the biggest cyber attack suffered by a public sector organization in the United States. So he sort of speaks to us about how he went in and the work he had to do to sort out the after effects of that. And it was very much about going back to basics. He spoke about how they had to get their basics right. They had to get their IT fundamentals correct after this attack. And he made the analogy with a sports star can't do anything really fancy and really skillful unless they have their basics down, which I thought was really nice. And they've sort of come out of the worst of that, and it was sort of business as usual. And then he spoke to us about what the city has faced through this sort of the pandemic, through COVID-19, and the city's response to it. And actually, what he says, if there is a silver lining for those guys, it's that the lessons that they learned from the cyber attack in 2018. And the challenges that's has thrown up has allowed them to be, far more equipped to deal with the challenges that this virus has thrown up too. He does also speak to us about, some of his longer term plans, about how he's working with some of the big tech companies to sort of serve some of the city's more underprivileged communities. But it very much the meat of the story is very much a sort of tale of two viruses, and how a really talented CIO has been able to sort of take both of them on with a really skilled team. So, from a writer's point of view, sometimes you write stuff that you enjoy, but you might not think is massively interesting sometimes. But I thought this one certainly was. I think anyone with even a passing interest in technology will really enjoy this one.
Yeah, it's got what you call what we call a hook, hasn't it? A real hook.
Certainly, yeah.
And I'd definitely recommend listeners to head over to techforgood.digitalbulletin.com right now to go and read the article. Rom, do you want to sort of give us a flavour of what else readers can look at on the platform, and sort of maybe a flavour of what's to come as well? Because I know you've had a lot of influence, certainly, on the type of stories that we've told in this first edition.
Yeah, so we're going to have a daily diet of news type content as ever, similar to Digital Bulletin. But the main topics of interest for Tech for Good are we're looking at education, we're looking at healthcare, we're looking at social good, and into which you could find many topics. But we're talking about how do you improve the nature of society in terms of how it can access services and facilities, and how can our public discourse improve, things like that. We're also looking at public sector, so that is where we're going to consider smart cities. We're going to look at connectivity and how that impacts how you might be able to better serve rural areas in different parts of the world, and so on. So there's quite a breadth of things that we're looking at. What we are lucky in being able to do is to be able to reach out and talk about these topics to some of the most influential leaders in their field across this area. So obviously you can find that in our first issue, which you can go and read now, but expect much more of the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it feels like obviously it's a very exciting time for our company, and it's also a very exciting time generally in the world of technology, I think. So there is, and we do want to focus on that kind of opportunity rather than not just the negative kind of side of the debate as well. Now it's time for us to move away from the global issues facing humanity right now and narrow our focus on our Norfolk County Council case study after this.
Find us as Digital Bulletin on LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram, and at Digi_Bulletin on Twitter.
On every pod, we take the opportunity to discuss one of our in-depth Digital Bulletin case studies. And this month, we're going to revisit our work with Norfolk County Council, so a topic very close to the Tech for Good angle as well. As a Norfolk-based company, this was obviously a subject matter very close to our hearts. Now, Kurt Frary was our interviewee, and he's the council's CTO and has dedicated pretty much his whole career to technology and Norfolk. Before we dive deeper into this case study, here is Frary talking about some of the challenges faced when trying to drive connectivity and innovation in a highly rural area.
Some of the challenges of living and working in a large rural county are it's rural. You haven't got connectivity, you haven't got that foundation there to maybe access the internet, use digital services, and we're cognizant of that. We know that actually if we're to help people in the adult social care arena, maybe help people stay in their homes longer, live independently longer, we need to use digital to enable that, and maybe so we can service more citizens. Also businesses in the region, if they haven't got connectivity where they want to start the business, where they want to operate, then they can't operate and they'll go somewhere else. So we're keen as a local authority to make sure we give businesses what they need, which is the foundation to digital services, which is connectivity. And we're also keen to make sure that we look at our own public services that we provide so we can service more people through digital, which means that our foundation has to be connectivity again. So that means that they're the core of our strategy. But that's the start of it. We'll get the connectivity right. We'll say to people, come to Norfolk, you've got the things you need. But then we need to innovate on top of that, both in the public and the private sector.
James, we've heard about the challenges there from Kurt. Do you want to give us an overview of some of the interesting things that Norfolk are doing right now with technology?
Yeah, definitely. There's a couple of big initiatives that they've got, but they all sort of feed into this one main goal that Kurt kept speaking about, which was to make Norfolk the best connected rural county in the UK. I think central to that is this LoRaWAN network, which they've developed, which is a low power, wide area network, into which they've sort of built hundreds of these IoT gateways. And what that's allowed them to do is build sort of huge tranches of data, which are being used by agricultural firms. It's been used by Norfolk County Council itself, to sort of track traffic levels, air quality, and it's free for private firms to use as well. And it's the first example of this, certainly free to use in the UK. And there's a lot. I think it's developed a lot of interest from other public sector companies in the UK. They said they've had people from the northeast, from Leeds, and from Leicester, all coming to look at what the team is doing. So I think he certainly likes to see himself as a sort of trailblazer in this aspect, and there's a lot to admire about what's going on at Norfolk. It might not be the first location when you think of public sector innovation, but there's certainly some exciting things going on there.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to bring up with you, Rom, as well. Norfolk is clearly putting a lot of effort into becoming a connected county, and were you impressed by how they appear to be leading in so many areas compared to their peers here?
Yeah, absolutely. Just for a bit of context, I suppose, for anyone outside of the UK, Norfolk is on the far eastern reaches of the United Kingdom, and is in UK terms, it's quite a large empty county, right? There's a lot of agriculture, and so connecting it isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. And so they've had to be very bold in terms of how they're approaching this. And the LoRaWAN work that they've done is trailblazing on UK terms. I think there's quite a lot of it going on in Europe as well. But fundamentally, it's incredibly potentially very useful technology. And this is wide area networks that they very small bandwidth, right? So you can't send videos and things over them. But what you can do is put a little transmitter in almost any device and connect it to a network in an IoT sense. And so it could be a vending machine, or a water meter, or a smoke alarm in a barn, or it could be anything. And what they are doing as a local authority is building the bedrock, the foundations upon which loads of innovation can occur. And in fact, we've ourselves shared offices with people that are actually leveraging that technology to, I believe in their case, measure the temperature of seats in large office buildings in order to be able to use those office buildings more efficiently, right? Because they can have a real-time measure of who's occupying which parts of the building, and therefore you can turn off heating in some sections, for example, and become more sustainable as a building. All sorts of applications. And yes, it is interesting that Norfolk itself, our local authority, is really blazing that trail. And as often we find, innovation happens when you're up against the wall a little bit. And that, I would say, coupled with Kurt's dynamism, is maybe what has led. The benefits are obviously so easy to see. The return on investment is so easy to see that all it took is someone of Kurt's character to do, to try it out and to find that boldness. And unfortunately, he's got a team around him who are able to build on that with him.
Yeah, definitely. Now, part of Norfolk's efforts to become a truly digital county has involved the gathering, as James said earlier, of as much data as possible from all of these various projects that we've spoken about just there. And as Ferrari explains here, he wants to ultimately create an open data program which would benefit every citizen and business in the area.
One of the things that we're doing is collecting a lot of data as part of these projects. So if you have a sensor, collects a piece of data, what's the temperature somewhere, or what's the rainfall like? So we're getting a lot of data. What's really interesting is once we get that data, you can put it together and make better sense of it and make better decisions. However, I've got an ambition to use as much of that data and publish it as a public record, so businesses can use it and private individuals. So for instance, if we're monitoring air quality across Norfolk, or we're monitoring rainfall, other services can use it, but other businesses, which means as a public record, that gives something back, but also allows us to then look across the county and become a real digital county, a smart county. And being a smart county, we've got a data set we can then build on. And the more data you put in, the more better information you'll get back. You can make really smart decisions if you've got the information you need to hand.
James, this approach to data, which Kurt spoke about there, it sounds really interesting, doesn't it? Certainly an example of real public service. You get the sense that Kurt is really driven by public service, isn't he?
Yeah, and what kept coming across was that, this initiative isn't for a certain section of people or a certain section of industry. His real drive is to use technology to improve, he said, the life of every citizen and every business within Norfolk. So that I think that's where that idea has come from, that every technology initiative that they do should help as many people or as many businesses as it possibly can. It can't be too narrow. It has to be able to scale, if you like.
Yeah. Rom, we know the words public sector and innovation don't necessarily go hand in hand all the time, do they? And especially when it comes to councils, and you tend to think of sort of slow-moving beasts. But in a way, this story kind of proves, especially with how Norfolk, as you said, trailblazing in certain areas, it disproves that theory, doesn't it? And maybe that's sort of another example of how technology really is coming to the fore, not just in private companies, but also in public organizations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they found a good blend of boldness versus astute planning to be able to drive an innovation agenda within a local authority that isn't normally easy to do. And let's be honest, in a public sector context, it is difficult to innovate, and there's reasons that are very good for that. These are typically institutions that are stocked with lots of people who've been doing the same thing for a lot of time. It's difficult from a culture and people and skills perspective to maneuver those things. But also, local authorities normally don't have any money, and inventing stuff normally costs lots of money. It doesn't make any money. And innovation is when something that has already been invented changes the world for the better somehow, and that's the difference between those two things. It's not incumbent upon public authorities to invent anything, but it is incumbent upon them to find proven solutions that they can be very sure will have a positive impact. And that's what Kurt's very good at. LoRaWAN isn't a new concept, but as an authority, he's been able to bring together the resource and the intent to actually invest in it and deploy it with a very good sense that return on investment will be there. And it's that sort of activity that you would like to think will encourage other local authorities to compartmentalize bits of their budgets and a few of their resources to achieve the same sorts of things. And in that sense, maybe what Kurt's doing is even more important than the actual technology itself, is to create a culture of innovation from within the necessary confines of a public sector, which is often obviously focused on the must-dos and not the nice-to-haves, if you see what I mean, because they've obviously got very limited budgets most of the time.
Yeah, I found this story really interesting, actually. And James, just to wrap up on this, was there anything else that you took away from it? Because it was different to the kind of stories that we usually cover, not just in the sense that it was just down the road from us, but also in the sense that it was sort of a public-facing organisation, and also you used to work there as well. I'll just throw that in.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, yeah, I got all the glamorous jobs. I got to go down the road to my former employer. But I think certainly it's changed from when I was there, which was in 2013, and having someone like Kurt, heading up the technology side of the business really helps. But actually, what came across most to me, and I think that, this is the same whether you're a public sector, big public sector organization like Norfolk County Council, or actually if you're in the private sector as well. To enact that change, Kurt clearly has the support of the top people at Norfolk County Council, and he spoke about his really close relationship with the chief executive. And the chief executive has said to him, if you have ideas that are not particularly expensive to go and trial, just go and do them. You don't even have to tell me, go and do it. So he has been liberated, him and his team, to think quite creatively and go out there and do them, and then go back when he's found the results. And I think that's, if you want to enact technology transformations or technology initiatives which are really successful, you need the support of the top people, whether that's the chief executive of a council or a CEO or a COO. So that was the thing that came across to me, how important it is to have support right at the top level, to enable you and your team to go out and be smart about what you're doing and be really creative from a technology point of view.
Yeah, and Kurt was so enthusiastic, wasn't he? You can certainly see why people would be convinced by any arguments that he made to do any technology initiatives, because he's certainly very passionate, very knowledgeable. And really, yes, you could tell as well that he had a lot of respect from the people he works with. And yeah, it's definitely a really interesting story, and one that's worth going to learn more about over on digitalbulletin.com, where you can read the full case study and watch some videos as well. We'll be back after another ever so brief interlude.
Power up your day with the Bulletin Brief, the latest news, insights and opinion delivered straight to your inbox.
Next up, we're going to hear from Jessica Nordlander. Now, Jess is currently COO of community exchange platform Thought Exchange over in Canada. Last year, she was named Sweden's most innovative leader and has previously worked for Google, while also helping different tech startups form and flourish. We chatted to Jess about the remote working revolution and whether the technology is actually in place to enable long-term and effective remote working. Her views are certainly well worth listening to, especially on this first question on how companies will balance office and remote working in the future.
I think it's important to remember that every individual has their own circumstances, right? I think depending on, I think it's super important to if you want to create a diverse workforce, it's super important to consider such things like, is it possible for every employee to have a dedicated workspace at home? Is it possible to have out-of-home childcare, those types of things? And if you truly want to build a diverse workforce, you need to be able to give people the opportunity to make their own choices that are fit for their situation. So I think when you say, we will never go back to office spaces, I think it's pretty easy to discriminate the people that maybe for some reason doesn't have the opportunity to work from home. So to me, it's still super, super important that you're able to work with your company in a way where people have choice. And of course, for a smaller company, it's an easier logistical challenge. For really big companies, it's going to be harder to not have clear-cut rules about what works for people or what works for the employees and what doesn't work. But I still think that these very blunt statements around either everyone needs to be back in the office or everyone is going to be remote, to me seems like a bit a bit scary in terms of at the same time driving diversity in your workforce.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's move on to the kind of tools and software that have sort of enabled this transition to remote working. We've seen companies like Zoom and other companies who've really benefited from this, and their software and their capabilities have really come to the fore. Do you think in the market today there are enough tools of that ilk and of different varieties to make sort of remote working easy for companies to do?
Yeah, good question. So I think there are a lot of tools that make it possible to digitize what you used to do in the office. So, you used to hold, in-person meetings with a number of people, and now you want to do the same meeting in the same way, virtually. There are tools that facilitates those things, or you used to have, project management software that you worked with when you were in the office, and there's tools to make those things easier as you go virtual. What I don't think there's enough of is, as tools that makes, if you see that as digitizing, just doing the same thing but in kind of a virtual format, there isn't enough, I think, tools that makes it possible to digitalize. So what I mean with that is to take full advantage of the opportunities that exist now when you're remote, or enough tools that actually elevates the experience beyond what it was when you were meeting face to face. So meetings weren't very good in the first place, right? Like, you have a meeting with 12 people in a meeting room, you have all these risks of unconscious bias, loudest voice, silent majority, like who speaks in these meetings, whose voice gets heard, what ideas gets brought forward, like those types of things, right? And those problems will just be magnified as you go to a virtual environment, because people will zoom out, they will start doing something else if they aren't engaged, like those risks increases. So I guess what I think is, like, there weren't enough tools to make meetings good in the first place, and the problems have only gotten bigger. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I guess also the sort of what you're trying to say is around the more complex, whether it's a meeting or whether you're talking about a project or a product and you need input from different people, the kind of like Zoom is great for just a normal like morning catch up or whatever, but a meeting where there's a lot more sort of detail to talk about, and maybe screens to be shared and all that kind of thing, the tools necessarily aren't as pervasive as those sort of standard ones.
Yeah, and I think for leaders, for example, like a big part of what leadership is to drive decision making, right? And also make sure that, you kind of somehow tap into that collective intelligence of all the people that you have in your organization. And I think it was difficult in the first place to keep people engaged, but, with people kind of physically disconnected from offices, many leaders that I talk to have found that that's even more difficult now. And I think that's when you're starting to think about that difference between like complicated and complex, right? I think we can still solve complicated problems pretty well, like who's going to do what and when, and how do we solve this specific problem and throw some experts on it. I think we're in the virtual environment, we can still solve those things pretty well with the tools that we have. But when it comes to complex issues like cultural transformation or trust building or decision making and those types of things, like those are the things that were complex problems in the first place, and they've just gotten even more complex now.
On the basis of what you just said, that an opportunity for software companies to come up with the solution that is going to sort of resolve these problems in remote working, there is a lot of opportunity there now, isn't it, for the big minds of Silicon Valley and the like?
Yeah, and I guess that for us, like we feel that we're partway there, right? At Thought Exchange, we saw a huge value for this product before, but in this virtual environment, it's just our usage has just exploded. I think we're up 600% in our usage over last year since COVID hit.
Yeah, do you want to talk a bit more about that and talk more about sort of exactly what you guys offer and why you think you've had that surge?
Yeah, so more or less, like it's a pretty simple thought. So the tool lets a leader ask an open-ended question. So the question, for example, that we see a lot of leaders asking, when COVID first hit is like, what do you need from the company right now? Like what you can ask that to 10,000 employees. What are your needs looking like right now? And what are the things we should be talking about? And then, every participant, let's say you're an employee of the company where the leader asks this question, you go in and you answer in your own words, you answer this question. Well, right now I feel that I need, some flexibility around work because I have small kids at home that I need to take care of and they can't go to school. And then once you've input your own thoughts, you go on to a step where you're able to interact with the thoughts of others. So in a completely transparent way, what everyone else has been written is served to you, and in a way that you get introduced to both things that you might agree with and things that you might disagree with. And you rate these thoughts of others. And then what the platform does is that, when all these people go through this crowdsourcing exercise, the things that the groups thinks is most important will come to the top and gets rated highest. So it more or less lets everyone contribute in their own words, rather than if you compare to a survey, the leader that is creating the survey doesn't need to come up only with the question, but they also need to come up with the answers.
Yeah.
Like, out of these 5 things, what are the things that you need most right now? And I think very few people have felt like super engaged and listened to when they respond to a survey where someone else just also already came up with the answers for me, right? So it allows everyone to participate with their own ideas, which means that you can tap into collective intellect, and then it allows you to engage with other people's ideas, and you then go through that crowdsource exercise with the group, deciding what's actually the most important things we should be talking about right now. The increase of the COVID, I think it's just really highlighted to leaders like how important it is to have these types of conversations, and how important it is for employees and communities to be able to help provide solutions to problems. I think that as a leader, if an individual walks into your office right now during this crisis, you're going to start by asking them how they're doing, right? How are you? And then you would probably go to, as a leader, what do you need? Like, how can I help you? And then only after dealing with those issues for this person, you can move on to things like, how does our business need to adapt, and how could this person contribute to those things, right? And I think that sometimes leaders right now come across as a bit tone deaf if they go directly to, like, how can we as a company innovate and transform and survive during this time, if you haven't taken the time in your organization to ask the questions that are the most fundamentally for people.
Yeah, it's really a people focus, isn't it? Just on a sort of wider topic, Jess, I'm interested to know what are the main challenges you felt you've faced as a leader of a business during this pandemic? What have sort of been the most pressing challenges for you personally?
I think that humans have a way of reacting in these situations that means that sometimes we lose focus on certain things for others, right? So for example, it's easy to when you need to do maybe both some cost cutting measures, but you also need to redefine yourself to actually survive for the future. It's really easy to go into some kind of like efficiency bias situation where you only think about like cutting back, when maybe what you should be doing is like ideating around like how are we going to get out of this situation, right? And I think that as humans, and this, you can see this in research too, we have this efficiency bias. That means that where we go first is to try to limit the risk, and anything new or innovative is seen as like a threat to what we're doing. So I think that's a huge challenge right now for companies to just like both try to, of course, do what they need to be doing to protect their business in the short term, but then, how about the things that we need to invest in today to make sure we're successful in the long term, and how do you do that kind of balancing act and trade-off between today and tomorrow? I think that's a huge challenge. The other thing I think is like, I'm going to come back to the people thing, right? Like, we need to remember that this is a huge crisis for every single individual, regardless of how you're affected. Like, even if you aren't directly affected and you're lucky enough to still have your job, I think that this neurological impact of the stress that the uncertainty like creates for us is just also really draining for most people. And how do you again balance, as a leader, the willingness and kind of the engagement from the employees to save the company, with making sure that people don't get burned out by the enormous amount of stress that people are facing right now. So that's again like a really important kind of dynamic balancing between engaging people and making sure they have enough time to recover and rest and spend time with their families.
Right, folks, that's enough from us today. Now, allow me to point you in the direction of some other bits. So as we discussed earlier, the very first edition of Tech for Good is now live. Just head over to techforgood.digitalbulletin.com. Issue 17 of Digital Bulletin is also available to read right now. And if you want more podcasts to help you shut off from the real world, a new episode of Fragmented Reality was released last week with Innovation Group's CTO, Mike Hinton. Now, guys, thanks for joining me today. James, are you now off to use some tech for good, I hope? Yeah? Yeah?
Yes, I suppose I am, in a sense.
Good. Good's our new word. Rom, goodbye. Thanks for joining us and me.
Good. Yes,
Good.
absolutely. Good. Everything good.
And to you, listener. Until next time, goodbye.
That was the Digital Bulletin podcast, brought to you by Bulletin Media. Listen and subscribe to a range of podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Plug in for news, features, and case studies on the very latest in enterprise technology and digital transformation.